She rescued a Comanche chief's son from Quicksand. 3 days later, he returned with his entire tribe. Welcome to Tales by Ezra. Let's uncover what really happened. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, a relentless, indifferent eye in a sky the color of bleached bone. Abigail Hayes shielded her own eyes with a hand calloused from work and worry, her gaze sweeping the parched horizon. Dust devils danced in the distance, ephemeral ghosts on a land that had long ago decided to offer little comfort. Her small homestead, a cabin of weathered pine and a barn leaning like an old man weary of standing, was an island in this sea of dry grass and stubborn scrub. It had been 5 years since Thomas, her husband, had been taken by the lung fever, and 3 since little Sarah, their only child, had followed him, a tiny bloom withered too soon. Grief was a constant companion now, a shadow that clung to her even under the brightest noon, its weight as palpable as the heavy wooden bucket she hauled from the near-dry well each morning. The silence of the place was the hardest. It pressed in, amplifying the whisper of the wind through the eaves, the mournful cry of a hawk circling overhead, the frantic scrabble of a mouse in the walls. Sometimes she would speak aloud, just to hear a human voice, even if it was only her own, rough and hesitant from disuse. Her days were a litany of chores, a rhythm of survival. Tending the small, struggling vegetable patch, mending fences Thomas had built, checking the snare she set for rabbit, though even the rabbits seemed scarce this year. The land demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep her tethered to it, a stubborn root in unforgiving soil. She missed Thomas's quiet strength, the way his hand would find hers in the evenings as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. She missed Sarah's laughter, a sound like wind chimes that used to fill the small cabin with a light that no darkness could entirely extinguish. Now, the light was muted, the cabin filled only with the ghosts of what had been. She often found herself staring out at the low, distant hills, the traditional lands of the Comanche, though she rarely saw any sign of them this close to the established, if sparsely populated, settler territories. Fear was a currency in these parts, traded in hushed whispers at the infrequent town gatherings, tales of raids and stolen livestock. Abigail tried not to listen. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had enough real struggles without borrowing imagined ones. This morning, like many others, she felt the familiar ache of despair trying to claw its way up from the pit of her stomach. The air was heavy, still, the kind of stillness that often preceded a storm, though the sky offered no such promise, only the relentless, shimmering heat. She had decided to check the Far Creek bed, a place Thomas had once said held water longer than others, though it had been dry for as long as she could remember. Hope was a stubborn weed, she supposed, and she, a reluctant gardener of it. She saddled Martha, her old mare, the horse's coat dull with dust, its ribs showing more than Abigail liked. The ride was slow, the heat radiating from the ground in visible waves, distorting the familiar landscape into something alien and unsettling. The silence here was different, deeper, the kind that swallowed sound and left only the thud of her own heart in her ears. It was a land that kept its secrets well, and its dangers even better. The creek bed, when she reached it, was as she'd expected, a scar of cracked mud and sun-baked stones snaking through the desolate plain. A few brittle, thorny bushes clung to its edges, their leaves coated in a fine, pale dust. Disappointment, a familiar companion, settled in her chest. She was about to turn Martha back towards the dubious comfort of her homestead when a flicker of movement, or rather, a lack of it in a place where movement should have been, caught her eye. Further down, where the creek bed widened into a shallow basin that sometimes, after a rare deluge, held a stagnant pool, something was amiss. She urged Martha forward, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The air here felt thicker, cloying, and there was a faint, rank smell like damp earth and something else, something organic and distressed. As she drew closer, the scene resolved itself into a nightmare. A patch of ground, darker than the surrounding earth, glistened wetly under the sun. It wasn't water. It was quicksand, or something treacherously similar, a deceptive, sucking mire hidden beneath a thin crust of dried mud. And trapped within it, sunk to his chest, was a boy, a Comanche boy. His dark hair was matted with mud and sweat. His copper skin stretched taut over high cheekbones. His eyes, wide and black, were fixed on her, filled not with the fear she might have expected, but with a fierce, desperate pride that seemed to fight against the terror that must be consuming him. He couldn't have been more than 10 summers old, his small frame already showing the strain of his struggle. His arms were outstretched, his hands clawing uselessly at the treacherous surface. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct, born of years of ingrained caution and the whispered fears of the frontier, was to turn, to flee. This was not her concern. This was dangerous territory in every sense of the word. His people, if they found her here, might not understand, might see her presence as a threat, her inaction as complicity. But then she saw his face, truly saw it. The youthful terror battling the ingrained stoicism. The slight tremor in his lips quickly suppressed. And in that moment, he wasn't a Comanche and a potential enemy. He was a child, alone and dying, much like her Sarah had been, though in a different, slower, but no less cruel way. The thought pierced through her fear like a shard of glass. She dismounted, her own legs feeling unsteady. "Hold still," she said, her voice rough, startling in the oppressive silence. She knew he likely didn't understand her words, but perhaps the tone, the intent, would carry. He watched her, his dark eyes unwavering, as she approached the edge of the mire. She tested the ground carefully, her boots sinking slightly even on what looked like solid earth. She needed something to reach him, something to give him purchase. Her rope, coiled on Martha's saddle, was too short. Her gaze scanned the desolate landscape. A dead, sun-bleached cottonwood limb lay half-buried in the sand a dozen yards away. It was long, but likely brittle. Still, it was all she had. She worked quickly, her movements economical, born of long practice in making do with little. She dragged the limb towards the quicksand, the rough bark scraping against her calloused palms. It was heavier than she expected, and the heat was making her dizzy. But the image of the boy's slowly sinking form spurred her on. "I'm going to try and reach this to you," she said, speaking more to herself than to him. "When I do, grab hold. Don't struggle too much. Try to pull, slow and steady." He said nothing, but his eyes, fixed on her, seemed to understand. This was a pact of survival, forged in a moment of shared desperation, across a chasm of culture and fear. Abigail braced herself, her boots sinking into the soft earth at the edge of the treacherous pit. The sun hammered down, reflecting off the wet surface of the mire, making her squint. She extended the cottonwood limb, pushing it slowly, carefully towards the trapped boy. It was agonizingly slow work. The limb was unwieldy, and she had to be careful not to overbalance and find herself in the same predicament. The boy watched, his small, mud-caked hands held ready. His breathing was shallow, but his gaze remained locked on the approaching wood, a lifeline in this desolate, devouring earth. Finally, the tip of the limb was within his reach. "Grab it," she urged, her voice tight with effort. "Hold tight." His fingers, surprisingly strong, closed around the wood. She felt the slight tug as he took its weight. "Now," she said, more to herself than to him, "we pull." She leaned back, planting her heels, her muscles screaming in protest. The limb creaked ominously. For a terrifying moment, she thought it would snap, but it held. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she began to draw him towards the edge. He helped, his small body working with a desperate strength, his movements controlled, not thrashing but pulling in concert with her efforts. Mud sucked and gurgled around him, reluctant to release its prey. Sweat poured down Abigail's face, stinging her eyes. Her arms ached, her back felt as though it might break. But she held on, her own survival instincts now inextricably linked with his. She thought of Sarah, of the helplessness she had felt watching her daughter fade. This, at least, was a fight she could wage, a life she might be able to save. Inch by agonizing inch, he came closer. She could see the strain on his face, the way his teeth were gritted against pain or fear, or both. But his eyes never left hers, a silent communication passing between them, a shared determination. Finally, with a last, desperate heave, his chest cleared the mire. He was still mired to his waist, but he was closer, close enough. "Keep holding," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She dropped to her knees, heedless of the sharp stones and thorns, and reached for his outstretched hand. His skin was cold, clammy, covered in a thick layer of mud, but his grip, when his fingers closed around hers, was like iron. She pulled, he pulled, and with a sickening, sucking sound, he came free. He collapsed onto the relatively solid ground at the edge of the pit, gasping for air, his small body trembling uncontrollably. Abigail, too, sank back, her own strength utterly spent. For a long moment, they both lay there, breathing heavily, the sun beating down on them, the silence of the plains returning, broken only by their ragged gasps. He was alive. She had done it. The boy, Keem, as she would later learn his name, might be interpreted from the soft sounds he eventually made, was covered from head to toe in the thick, cloying mud. It was already beginning to dry and crack in the relentless heat, encasing him like a grotesque second skin. He was shivering despite the sun, a reaction to shock and exhaustion. Abigail knew she had to get him cleaned, warmed, and a shelter. Her cabin, humble as it was the only refuge for miles. She rose unsteadily, her muscles protesting every movement. "We need to get you cleaned up," she said, her voice still hoarse. She gestured towards Martha, then towards the distant silhouette of her cabin. He watched her, his dark eyes still wary, but the fierce defiance had softened, replaced by a profound weariness. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. She moved to help him, and this time, he didn't resist, allowing her to support his slight weight as she half-carried, half-dragged him towards the waiting mare. Getting him onto Martha's back was another struggle. He was weak, and she was nearly spent, but somehow they managed. She mounted behind him, her arms around his small, mud-caked torso to keep him from falling, and urged the old horse homeward. The ride was slow, each jolt sending a fresh wave of pain through Abigail's aching muscles. Keem remained silent, his head lolling against her shoulder, his breathing shallow. She could feel the cold dampness of the mud seeping through her own worn dress. Back at the cabin, she eased him off the horse and led him inside. The small, dim interior, smelling faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs, must have seemed like another world to him after the harsh glare of the plains. She sat him on a low stool near the cold hearth while she fetched water from the rain barrel, her movements slow and deliberate. Cleaning him was a difficult, awkward task. The mud was thick, clinging stubbornly to his skin and hair. She worked gently, using a soft rag and lukewarm water, trying to be as impersonal as possible, aware of his vulnerability, his innate pride. He endured her ministrations in silence, his eyes downcast, though she occasionally felt his gaze on her face, curious, assessing. She found a few minor cuts and bruises beneath the mud, but nothing serious. The quicksand had not broken him, only sought to swallow him. When he was finally clean, his skin a warm copper, his dark hair falling damply around his face, she wrapped him in one of Thomas's old woolen shirts, the fabric absurdly large on his small frame, but clean and warm. She then set about rekindling the fire, her hands moving with an ingrained familiarity. Soon, a small blaze crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls, chasing away some of the cabin's perpetual chill. She offered him a tin cup of water, which he drank greedily, then a piece of dry jerky, which he ate slowly, his eyes still watchful. The silence between them was thick, not with hostility, but with the unbridgeable chasm of their different worlds and the raw, unspoken reality of what had just transpired. He was a Comanche boy, she a white settler. By all the unwritten laws of this land, They should be enemies. Yet, she had saved his life. And now, he was in her home, a fragile, temporary truce declared in the face of shared humanity. She didn't know what would happen next, what she should do. But for now, he was safe. And that, she realized with a surprising pang, mattered to her. The first night Keem spent in Abigail's cabin was a tapestry woven from silence and unspoken anxieties. He sat on a stool by the hearth, wrapped in Thomas's oversized shirt, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. His earlier exhaustion had given way to a tense alertness. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside, made him flinch almost imperceptibly. Abigail moved about her evening chores with a deliberate slowness, trying to project an air of normalcy she did not feel. She prepared a thin stew of dried beans and the last of her hoarded salt pork, the aroma filling the small space. She set a bowl before him, along with a spoon. He looked at it, then at her, his dark eyes unreadable. After a moment, he picked up the spoon, his movements hesitant, unfamiliar. He ate slowly, carefully, as if each mouthful were a decision. Abigail ate her own meager portion, standing by the rough wooden counter, her back mostly to him. She could feel his eyes on her, though a constant, silent assessment. Her internal monologue was a torrent of conflicting thoughts. What had she done? Harboring a Comanche boy, even one she had saved, was a dangerous act. If word got out to the settlers in the distant township, they would brand her a traitor or worse. And his own people, would they see her as a savior or a captor? Would they come looking for him? And if they did, what then? She remembered Sarah, her small hand clutching Abigail's finger, her trust absolute. This boy, Keem, was a stranger from a world that was, by all accounts, hostile to hers. Yet, looking at his small, vulnerable form, the way his damp hair clung to his forehead, the lingering tremor in his hands, she felt a pang of something akin to maternal protectiveness, an emotion she had thought buried with her daughter. When the meal was finished, she cleared the bowls. She had only one bed, a narrow cot in the corner. She gestured towards it, then towards the floor by the fire, offering him a choice. He looked at the cot, then at the hearth, and chose the floor, curling up on the worn rag rug she kept there, pulling the edges of Thomas's shirt tighter around himself. Abigail laid out an old, mended quilt near him, a silent offering. He didn't acknowledge it at first, but later, when she thought he was asleep, she saw him reach out a small hand and pull it over himself. She lay down on her cot, fully clothed, her old hunting rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. Sleep was a distant prospect. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the empty silence of her solitary grief, but a silence filled with the soft breathing of another human being, a child's breath, fragile and rhythmic. Each breath was a reminder of the precariousness of their situation, of the invisible lines she had crossed. She thought of the stories Thomas used to tell, stories of fierce Comanche warriors, of raids and reprisals. Were Keem's people out there now, searching for him, their hearts filled with fear and anger? Would they see her cabin as a prison, her actions as an abduction? The wind picked up outside, rattling the ill-fitting shutters, sounding like mournful sighs. Abigail closed her eyes, but her mind raced. She had acted on instinct, on a fundamental human impulse to save a life. But instinct had consequences in this harsh land, consequences she might not be prepared to face. Yet, as she listened to the boy's quiet breathing, a strange sense of calm, or perhaps resignation, settled over her. She had done what she had to do. What came next was out of her hands. For tonight, at least, they were both alive, two solitary souls sharing a fragile shelter against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The second day dawned gray and overcast, the oppressive heat of the previous day replaced by a cool, damp breeze that hinted at rain. Keem was awake before Abigail, sitting by the cold embers of the fire, his dark eyes fixed on the cabin door as if willing it to open and offer escape. When Abigail stirred, he didn't look at her, his small face set in a stoic mask. She rekindled the fire, The familiar routine, a small comfort in the unsettling new reality of her home. She offered him a piece of leftover cornbread, which he accepted with a slight nod, eating it slowly, his gaze still distant. Communication remained a challenge. Abigail tried a few simple words in English, accompanied by gestures, but he showed no sign of understanding or perhaps of willingness to understand. His silence was a wall, formidable and unyielding. She pointed to herself. "Abigail," she said clearly. He merely stared. She pointed to him. "You?" No response. She sighed. This was going to be harder than she thought. She went about her morning chores, tending to Martha, scattering feed for the few scrawny chickens that had survived the lean year, checking her snares, empty as usual. Keem watched her from the cabin doorway, a silent, observing presence. He didn't offer to help, nor did she expect him to. He was a guest, of sorts, or perhaps a prisoner. She wasn't sure which, and suspected he felt the same ambiguity. Later, as she was weeding the small vegetable patch, her back aching, her hands raw, she felt his eyes on her. She glanced up. He was standing a few feet away, watching her pull the stubborn weeds from the dry, cracked earth. He then looked at the wilting tomato plants, their leaves curled and yellowed from lack of water. Without a word, he turned, picked up the empty water bucket by the cabin door, and headed towards the well. Abigail watched him, surprised. The well was old, the mechanism stiff. It was hard work for a boy his size, but he managed, his small arms straining as he cranked the handle, drawing up a bucket of precious water. He carried it back to the garden, his steps careful, and began to water the thirsty plants, his movements precise, economical. He didn't look at Abigail, didn't seek her approval. He simply did what needed to be done. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement, perhaps, of their shared predicament, a recognition that survival, even in this strange, temporary alliance, required effort from both of them. When he finished, he set the bucket down and stood looking at the garden, his expression unreadable. Abigail walked over to him. "Thank you," she said softly. He glanced at her, then quickly away, a flicker of something, pride, embarrassment, in his dark eyes. That afternoon, the rain came, a soft, steady drizzle that promised to turn the dust to mud. They sat inside the cabin, the door closed against the damp chill. Abigail took out her mending basket, her fingers busy with a tear in her apron. Keem sat by the fire, idly tracing patterns in the hearthstones with a charred stick. The silence between them was less strained now, almost companionable. Abigail found herself humming a tune, an old lullaby her mother used to sing. Keem's head tilted slightly, as if listening. She risked a small smile in his direction. He didn't smile back, but he didn't look away either. She knew, with a growing certainty, that she couldn't keep him here indefinitely. It wasn't safe for either of them. He had a people, a family, who would be searching for him, and she, a lone woman, could not protect him if they came with ill intent, nor could she defend herself against the accusations of her own kind if he was discovered. He needed to go home. But how? And where was home for him? The vast, unmarked plains offered no easy answers. The rain continued for most of the third day, a relentless, gray curtain that trapped them within the cabin's confining walls. Keem's initial wariness had softened into a quiet observation. He watched Abigail as she moved about her tasks, kneading dough for a meager loaf of bread, sharpening Thomas's old hunting knife, mending a leak in the cabin roof with practiced hands. He seemed to absorb every detail, his dark eyes missing nothing. Abigail, in turn, found herself studying him. He was small for his age, but there was a wiry strength about him, a resilience that was both heartbreaking and admirable. His hands, though childlike, were capable, his movements economical. She noticed the way he would instinctively turn towards any sound from outside, his body tensing, a wild, untamed alertness that spoke of a life lived on the edge. By late afternoon, the rain finally stopped, though the sky remained heavy and overcast. A watery sun peeked through the clouds, casting a pale, ethereal light over the sodden landscape. Keem stood by the cabin window, staring out at the dripping trees, his expression unreadable. Abigail knew the time had come. He was stronger now, the mud and exhaustion washed away. He needed to leave, to find his way back to his people. The thought brought a pang of something she didn't want to name, a reluctance to break this fragile, unspoken connection, a fear of returning to the suffocating loneliness that had been her constant companion. But she pushed it down. This wasn't about her. It was about him, about his survival, his belonging. She approached him slowly. "It's time," she said, her voice gentle. "You need to go home." He turned to face her, his expression stoic, but she saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even a hint of sadness, in his dark eyes. She had gathered what few supplies she could spare. A small pouch of dried meat, a water skin filled from the rain barrel, the mended quilt for warmth. She held them out to him. He hesitated for a moment, then took them, his small hand brushing hers. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a surprising jolt through her. She walked with him to the edge of her cleared land, where the tall prairie grass began, still damp and bowed from the rain. She didn't know which direction his people lay, but she pointed towards the distant, hazy line of hills to the west, a direction she vaguely associated with Comanche territory from old, half-forgotten tales. "Your people," she said, gesturing. "That way, I think." He looked toward the hills, then back at her. For a long moment, their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of the strange, profound bond that had formed between them in these few short days. Then, he did something that surprised her. He reached into the pouch at his waist, a pouch she hadn't noticed before, skillfully hidden beneath Thomas's oversized shirt, and pulled out a small, intricately beaded amulet, shaped like a feather. He held it out to her. Abigail stared at it, then at him, her throat tightening. "I can't," she began, but he pressed it into her palm, his small fingers closing hers around it. He then stepped back, gave her one last, long look, and turned, disappearing into the tall grass with a speed and silence that was startling. She watched until the swaying grass swallowed him completely, until there was no sign that he had ever been there, except for the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and wildness, and the cool, smooth beads of the amulet clutched in her hand. She stood there for a long time, the damp wind whipping her hair around her face, a profound sense of loss settling over her, sharper and more immediate than she would have thought possible. He was gone. She was alone again, but the silence that descended now felt different, heavier, tinged with a worry that was not entirely for herself. Would he make it? Would he find his way? Or would the harsh, unforgiving land claim him after all? She turned and walked slowly back to the empty cabin, the beaded feather a small, precious weight in her hand, a tangible reminder of the boy who had, for a brief, extraordinary time, shared her solitude. The 3 days that followed Keem's departure were a return to Abigail's familiar solitude, yet everything felt altered. The cabin seemed emptier, the silence louder, more profound. She went about her chores with a heavy heart, her thoughts constantly straying to the small, stoic boy, now somewhere out on the vast, indifferent plains. Had he found shelter? Was he safe? The beaded amulet he had given her lay on the rough wooden mantelpiece, a splash of vibrant color against the drabness of her existence. She would pick it up sometimes, running her thumb over the smooth, cool beads, a tangible link to the child who had briefly, unexpectedly, touched her life. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. The sky remained a dull, leaden gray, the wind whispering through the tall grass with a mournful sound. Abigail found herself constantly scanning the horizon, though she wasn't sure what she was looking for or what she feared. Part of her expected, or perhaps even hoped, to see a small figure emerge from the distance, returning. Another, more practical part, braced for trouble. If Keem didn't make it back to his people, they would undoubtedly search for him. And if they found her, what then? Would they believe her story? Or would they see her as an enemy, responsible for his disappearance? The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her days. She also worried about the settlers. If word got out that she had harbored a Comanche boy, even for a few days, the repercussions could be severe. Prejudice ran deep in these parts, fueled by fear and ignorance. She would be an outcast, her already precarious existence made even more so. She kept her rifle close, her senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every distant cry of a bird, made her jump. The isolation that had once been a source of both grief and a strange sort of peace now felt menacing, leaving her exposed, vulnerable. She replayed her last moments with Keem over and over in her mind. Had she done the right thing, sending him out alone? Should she have tried to accompany him, to find his tribe herself? But that would have been madness. A lone white woman venturing into Comanche territory. It would have endangered them both. No, she had done what she had to do, what she thought was best. The rest was out of her hands. On the third morning after his departure, she awoke with a sense of unease sharper than usual. The air was still too still. The birds were silent. Even the wind seemed to have died down. She stepped outside the cabin, her gaze sweeping the empty plains. Nothing. Just the vast, unbroken expanse of land under a pale, indifferent sky. She tried to shake off the feeling, to tell herself it was just her nerves, her imagination. But the feeling persisted, a prickling on her skin, a tightening in her chest. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones, in the very air she breathed. She spent the morning reinforcing the latch on her cabin door. A futile gesture, she knew, if real trouble came. But it gave her something to do, a way to channel her nervous energy. She checked her rifle, ensuring it was loaded, her ammunition pouch full. She was not a fighter, not by nature, but she would defend herself, her home, what little she had left. As midday approached, the stillness was broken by a faint, distant sound. Hoofbeats, many hoofbeats. Her heart leaped in her throat. She ran to the small rise behind her cabin, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and peered towards the western horizon. At first, she saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze. Then, a dark line appeared, resolving itself into a column of riders, moving steadily, purposefully, towards her homestead. There were dozens of them, warriors in their prime, their painted faces grim, their feathered lances glinting in the pale sunlight. At their head rode a man of imposing stature, his bearing regal, his expression unreadable. And beside him, on a smaller pony, rode Keem. Abigail's legs felt weak. She wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. This was it, the reckoning she had feared, and in some strange way, anticipated had arrived. Abigail stood her ground as the column of riders approached, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. There was no point in running, no place to hide in this vast, open land. She had made her choice 3 days ago, when she had pulled a dying boy from the sucking mud. Now, she would face the consequences of that choice. She walked slowly back to her cabin, her old rifle held loosely in her hand, not as a threat, but as a symbol, perhaps, of her resolve not to be easily broken. The riders fanned out, forming a silent, menacing semicircle around her small homestead. The air crackled with a palpable tension. The only sounds the snorting of the horses, the creak of leather, the faint jingle of adornments. Keem, looking small and solemn on his pony, avoided her gaze. The imposing figure at the head of the warriors, whom Abigail assumed to be the boy's father, the chief, dismounted. He was a man in his prime, his face a mask of hardened lines and quiet authority, his eyes dark and piercing, missing nothing. He moved with a lithe, powerful grace, his presence radiating an aura of command that was both intimidating and impressive. He stopped a dozen paces from Abigail, his gaze sweeping over her, her humble cabin, the struggling patch of garden. His expression remained unreadable, a stony facade that revealed nothing of his thoughts, his intentions. Abigail met his gaze steadily, her own face pale but composed. She would not show fear, though it churned like a cold serpent in her belly. She had done nothing wrong, nothing she was ashamed of. She had saved a child's life. If that was a crime in his eyes, or in the eyes of her own people, then so be it. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Abigail could feel the eyes of every warrior on her, judging, assessing. She thought of Thomas, of Sarah. If this was to be her end, she would meet it with the same quiet dignity they had shown in the face of their own mortality. Finally, Keem slipped off his pony and walked, with a hesitant dignity, to stand beside his father. He looked at Abigail then, a quick, fleeting glance, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of emotions she couldn't decipher. Fear, gratitude, apology? The chief placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. Then, he spoke, his voice low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. The words were in his own tongue, a language Abigail did not understand, but the tone was clear. It was a demand, a question, an accusation. Keem looked at his father, then at Abigail, his small face troubled. He seemed to be translating, or perhaps conveying the gist of his father's query. He pointed to himself, then to the creek bed in the distance, then back to Abigail, his gestures eloquent in their simplicity. He was telling the story, his story, of the quicksand of her rescue. Abigail listened, her gaze fixed on the chief's stern face. She saw no softening there, no hint of gratitude, only a continued, unwavering scrutiny. When Keem finished his silent narrative, the chief spoke again, his voice sharper this time. Keem looked at Abigail, then gestured towards her, then towards himself, a questioning look in his eyes. He seemed to be asking, why? Why did you help me, an enemy? Abigail took a deep breath. She had no way to explain in words he would understand. So, she did the only thing she could. She looked directly at the chief, her gaze unflinching, and then she looked at Keem, her expression softening. She placed her hand over her heart, a universal gesture of sincerity, of feeling. Then, she simply pointed to Keem, a motherly concern in her eyes that transcended language, transcended culture. He was a child. He was in danger. That was reason enough. The chief's dark eyes narrowed. He studied her for a long, unnerving moment, as if trying to see into her very soul, to discern the truth of her motives. Abigail held his gaze, her own heart surprisingly calm now. She had done what was right. Whatever happened next, she would face it with a clear conscience. The silence that followed Abigail's simple gesture was profound, broken only by the restless stamping of a horse and the sigh of the wind through the dry grass. The Comanche warriors sat motionless on their ponies, their dark eyes fixed on their chief, awaiting his judgment. The chief's gaze remained locked on Abigail, his expression still a formidable, unreadable mask. Abigail could feel the weight of his scrutiny, the power he held over her life, over the fate of her small, lonely homestead. But a strange sense of peace had settled over her. She had faced death before, in the slow, agonizing decline of her husband and child. This, if it came, would be quicker, cleaner. Keem shifted Yunizanhali beside his father, his small face etched with worry. He looked from his father to Abigail, then back again, as if pleading silently for her life. The chief remained impassive for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in his stern demeanor seemed to shift. It wasn't a smile, not even a softening of his features, but a subtle relaxation of the tension in his shoulders, a slight inclination of his head, as if acknowledging something he had not expected to find. He spoke again, his voice still low and resonant, but without the sharp edge it had held before. Keem listened intently, then turned to Abigail, a look of dawning relief on his face. He made a series of gestures, pointing to Abigail, then to himself, then to his father, and then he mimed the act of giving, of offering. Abigail didn't understand the specifics, but the intent seemed clear. This was not a declaration of war, but something else entirely. The chief then did something that startled her. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a single, perfect eagle feather, its white tip a stark contrast to its dark base. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, and held it out to Abigail. She hesitated, her eyes questioning. Keem nodded encouragingly. Slowly, she reached out and took the feather. It was surprisingly light, yet it felt imbued with a profound weight, a significance she could only guess at. The chief spoke again, a few short, guttural words. Then, without another look at Abigail, he turned, swung himself onto his horse with an effortless grace, and gestured to his warriors. As one, they wheeled their ponies and began to ride away, their departure as silent and sudden as their arrival. Keem lingered for a moment. He looked at Abigail, a small, shy smile finally gracing his lips. He touched his heart, then gestured towards her, a clear expression of gratitude, of connection. Then, he too mounted his pony and galloped after his father, his small figure quickly disappearing into the dust raised by the departing tribe. Abigail stood alone in front of her cabin, the eagle feather clutched in her hand, watching until the last rider had vanished over the horizon. The silence that descended now was different from any she had known before. It was not the silence of loneliness, nor the silence of fear. It was a silence of awe, of disbelief, of a profound, humbling gratitude. They had come, not to punish, but to acknowledge. The eagle feather, she sensed, was a symbol of respect, of peace, perhaps even of a debt repaid. She looked down at the feather, its perfect symmetry a testament to the wild beauty of this land, a land that held both cruelty and unexpected grace. She didn't know what the future held. The challenges of her solitary existence remained, but something within her had shifted. The encounter had cracked open the shell of her grief, letting in a sliver of light, a renewed sense of connection to the world, to life itself. She was still alone, but she no longer felt entirely isolated. She had touched another life, bridged a chasm of fear and mistrust, and in return had been touched by a gesture of profound, unexpected humanity. The land still felt vast, the sky indifferent. But now, as she looked out over the empty plains, she saw not just desolation, but a landscape of possibility, a place where even in the harshest of circumstances, understanding, and perhaps even a fragile kind of peace, could take root. The days that followed the Comanche's departure were imbued with a quiet sense of wonder for Abigail. The eagle feather held a place of honor on her mantelpiece, beside the beaded amulet Keem had given her. They were talismans, reminders of an encounter that had irrevocably altered the landscape of her inner world. She returned to her solitary routine, but the edges of her grief felt softer now, the sharp sting of loneliness blunted by the memory of Keem's smile, of his father's solemn, unexpected gesture. The silence of the cabin no longer felt oppressive. It was a space for reflection, for a quiet gratitude that settled in her heart like fine, warm dust. She found herself looking at the land with new eyes. The harshness was still there, the unforgiving sun, the scarcity of water, the constant struggle for survival. But she also saw a stark, resilient beauty, a tenacity in the way life clung to the arid soil, a reflection, perhaps, of her own stubborn endurance. She thought often of Keem, wondering about his life, his people. Would she ever see him again? Unlikely. Their paths had crossed, briefly, miraculously, and now had diverged again, each returning to their own world. Yet, a bond had been forged, an unspoken understanding that transcended the barriers of language and culture. It was a fragile thread, but it connected her to something larger than herself, to the intricate, often invisible web of human experience. One cool evening, as she sat on her porch watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky, she heard a sound she hadn't heard in years, the distant, rhythmic drumming of a nighthawk. It was a sound Thomas had loved, a sound that had always brought a sense of peace to their small corner of the world. She smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached her eyes. It felt like a sign, a benediction. The world was still a hard place, and her life would continue to be a struggle. But she was no longer just a survivor, defined by her losses. She was Abigail Hayes, a woman who had faced fear and chosen compassion, a woman who had saved a life, and in doing so, had perhaps saved a part of herself. The memory of the Comanche tribe surrounding her homestead, once a terrifying prospect, now held a different meaning. It was not a memory of threat, but of a profound, unspoken encounter, a testament to the possibility of connection in the most unlikely of circumstances. She knew that her own people, the settlers in the distant town, would never understand. If they knew her story, they would likely condemn her, fear her, isolate her even more. But their judgment no longer held the same power over her. She had found a different kind of acceptance, a different kind of peace in the heart of the wilderness, in the eyes of a Comanche chief and his son. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars blazed with a fierce, cold beauty, Abigail rose and went inside her small cabin. She stoked the embers in the hearth, the familiar ritual a comfort. The eagle feather and the beaded amulet caught the firelight, their colors glowing softly in the dimness. They were symbols of a bridge built across a chasm of fear, a testament to a shared humanity. She was still alone, but she was no longer adrift. She had found an anchor, a quiet strength, in the unexpected gift of another's life, and in the equally unexpected gift of their respect. The future remained uncertain, a vast, unmarked territory. But Abigail Hayes faced it with a courage she hadn't known she possessed, her heart a little lighter, her spirit a little stronger, under the silent, watchful stars of the great, wide plains.